So, but anyway, so I was working there on well, a couple of things. The first thing I did was decided to kind of ease into my, kind of research leave semester in Paris by revising for publication an article that I had done the year before. I had given a talk at Cardiff University on it was called Embodied Metaphor: Playing with Gender in South Asia, and it was based on earlier fieldwork I'd done in Pakistan and about this cross-dressing Sufi, basically. So I managed to get that done in that 2 months that I was there, and then
the cross-dressing Sufi that you mentioned. There's an image you share in the Triple I interview. Is he in that where your daughter's 2 years old and he's offering a sweet and which it's that person.
It's that person. Yeah. And when I had where is that image anyway? Is that in an article?
I saw I just saw it in the talk itself. You share it as a slide in.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that was that because there was that Cardiff lecture was recorded. What is on YouTube?
Okay, I haven't seen that one. Right. Yeah.
Oh, anyway, yeah. So it was kind of going back to old material and it was sort of a segue, or bringing together the sort of the work I'm doing on Sufism with this book that I am rather embarrassed to say I'm still finishing up but working on now is the book on sex reassignment surgery in Calcutta, which is not focused on Islam or Muslims. So, but the gender issue and
right. Could you, because I virtually know nothing on this topic vis-a-vis transgenderism in the context of Sufism, because that's a very interesting example that you mentioned of the Sufi that we saw an image of. Could you say a little bit as far as maybe Sufism in sort of broad-based terms, what Sufism's understanding of gender and gender roles, and how someone who identifies as not typically masculine or male can fit into that picture?
Well, that's interesting because the way you've asked the question is already sort of
a set of assumptions,
moving into sort of an identity model and
right, yes.
So I one of the sources that I draw on is sort of even going back to Ibn Arabi. And actually, Sadia Sheikh has written about Ibn Arabi and gender, and there's some really interesting passages where he's basically has this sort of cosmological model of the masculine and the feminine that are not tied to the body in the sense that men and women can be both masculine and feminine. And so some of these ideas can be sort of traced through Sufism of the sort of the ungendered self, I think is what's, I mean, it's not always expressed like that in the Sufi tradition. It's the sort of female, sort of historical Sufi, Rabia, was described by later Sufis as a man because she has this sort of basically the soul of a man,
Yes.
Not that she was biologically a man, but that one has to treat her. She's socially a man.
Right.
So there's various
Mm.
points in the tradition where gender and the body are not so closely attached, or even, I don't mention this in the paper, but even sort of the law that Khomeini in Iran, when asked about, or fatwa, I should say, was asked, whether, what he thought about sex reassignment surgery, and issued a fatwa saying that's, if somebody has a sort of a female soul, then yeah, sex change surgery is okay.
Wow, I did not know that. That's profound.
Yeah.
Wow.
I didn't put it very well, but yeah. So
this is profound.
So that's part of the kind of underpinning. And what I'm arguing in the paper is that instead of asking about, oh yeah, what is somebody's real identity, or I think sort of the model that underlies the rationale for sex change surgery is that and sort of a diagnostic criterion almost in the strictly medical model is that somebody is a woman trapped in a man's body, for example, for male to female transition. And, that's, that whole rationale sort of rests on an idea that there is an essentially gendered self. And so what I'm doing in the paper is sort of saying, well, why would this Sufi be wearing women's clothes? And is it that he is essentially a woman, or is there something else going on? And it's basically looking at how the body itself is treated as a kind of a metaphor at multiple levels. So that the idea of the bride of God, for example, is one of the ways it's often interpreted. And then within certain, Sufis have talked about, and I'm pretty sure Ibn Arabi himself had said, before you can, well, I guess before you should have relations with women, you should fully experience yourself as a woman yourself. Therefore, to as a kind of a spiritual development. So the whole development of the self as something that's not so attached to gender as a limitation on one's perspective on the world. I think is a good deal of what is signified by the transdressing, cross-dressing Sufi body.
Well, this
so I explore that.
Yeah, well, this rings very true. So despite my original phrasing of the question, you're right. I was sort of consciously or unconsciously immediately going to the the identity issue. And yet, despite the fact that I have been aware for a very long time of Sufism's very kind of complex, at least in spiritual terms, and maybe I'm kind of making this, I was making this distinction for myself. Oh, this is just in spiritual terms, because even Anne-Marie Chamel's short work called My Soul is a Woman. That the soul has these feminine attributes, and that a man, biological male, has both feminine and masculine attributes, which he is meant to cultivate, and vice versa in the biological female. So it's interesting to think, for myself, reflect on my own somehow getting caught up in these modern conversations, right, about identity, and which so much, and we're all sort of modern subjects in some shape or form, and this is a problem. But this is, and the fatwa that you mentioned about Khomeini is fascinating, and Shia Islam I've always found very, very fascinating in general. I find that intellectually, in many ways, they're way ahead of, this is a huge generalization, but I'm going to make it anyway, which is that in many ways they're way ahead of a lot of Sunni thinkers. They've managed to stay at the cutting edge of stuff. There's, for instance, a relatively recent fatwa, not related to gender reassignment, but related to the issue of taking psychedelics for the sake of spiritual, as a tool, right?
Really?
Yeah, and so I forget both of the people's names. Both the Iranian very senior Ayatollah who makes the fatwa, and the American Sufi who approaches him originally, if I'm not mistaken, who himself uses psychedelics in his own practice and amongst his students, as it were. And the fatwa is that if used under correct guidance, then psychedelics are absolutely permissible. And I remember when I first came across this, it was a small sort of article. The person sharing it, her name's Gray Henry. She's a very interesting woman who is behind a lot of publications. She made the point that the significance of this fatwa is, it's as if someone, the Pope in the Catholic Church, basically saying you can take psychedelics as part of your religion, and yet this is lost on people. The depth of this and the power of this. So for Khomeini to make that pronouncement, that's significant. And of course, Sunnis won't accept it because they have their own political problems. But
right. Yeah, so the idea is not to say this surgery is right or wrong or good or bad, and people have different reasons for doing it, but rather to just trying to push the conversation in another direction. And that's kind of what I did with it. Really exploring how metaphor is used in the Persian and Arabic literary traditions as well, and then and actually in the Urdu. Just briefly sort of summarizing that as part of the background.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about the importance of metaphor for making sense of life itself? I know that it's a very, in Quranic language, right? God, from a Muslim point of view, is always reminding the believer to look to the heavens and the earth and all, to look at all of his/her creation, and to come to realize that this is a symbol. This speaks to something much higher than itself, and ultimately to the divine reality. So, and this was understood through pretty much all of Muslim history, that the text is not to be read literally. It has to be sort of interpreted, and the levels of meaning. And so, can you say a little bit about the issue of metaphor then in Urdu, and how it plays into human religious spiritual expression?
Yeah. So the significance of metaphor and metonymy as well has been explored in the Arabic tradition, often in precisely the way you're describing it, as ways of pointing to the divine and ways of coming to experience the divine in human life. As you move into the Persian and Urdu traditions, of course it gets tied up with love poetry, and there's sort of a broader range of ways that metaphor is used. But one of the key things is that it's not like you're sort of looking at one metaphor and then trying to sort of trace the layers of significance of that one metaphor, but rather you have almost incomprehensibly in a lot of this poetry, metaphors that, so you'll have one short verse, and there'll be multiple metaphors. And it's not like the underlying significance is of one metaphor and then of another, but one metaphor points to another in these kind of chains. And it draws the reader to something that is not fully contained within any one metaphor. So, and this is something that's, also developed in the Urdu tradition, in part influenced by the Sanskritic sort of linguistic theories as well. So it allows for sort of pointing to things that can't fully be known, and including aspects of oneself and one's experience. So I could go on more, but so what I'm trying to do then is say, and we're not limited to poetry as a medium, that we think of, if we think of dress, we think of the body as another, as the human being embedded in the poetry of life. So you go and visit this Sufi who has or had a a family shrine that he was the Sajjada Nashin of. Then this is like the setting of a poem. I don't say this in the paper. I'm just sort of thinking of this now. And so reading him, you need to read all the other things that are going on in this environment, including the Qawwali that's being played, people going into trance, the allusions to the famous Qalandar, Lal Shahbaz Qalandar in Sindh, and his dress. The clothing actually also points to Lal Shahbaz Qalandar and that whole tradition. Probably in the interviews that I had, he doesn't. You mentioned intoxicants. He doesn't actually use these intoxicants. This is very much from the perspective of his sister-in-law describing his life and such. But he had a devoted follower that came to stay with him at a certain point in his life, and he was described as having been using these drugs until he came to Sain Sab and the Sufi, and at that point, he stopped using them. But there's the close intertwining of that tradition, which is also associated with Lal Shahbaz Qalandar, and what was going on at Sain Sab's, well, not his grave, but the grave of his family. Anyway, so I'm just trying to, in the paper, just think about gender and the Sufi tradition, but as we said, moving away from identity to instead use something like cross-dressing as a way of and gender itself as a way of more fully understanding what's going on in this local scene, which is also very much tied to the Sufi tradition that is very much not, limited to this little region in the Punjab. But then also pointing out that with modern identity politics associated with the third gender in Pakistan, that somebody like him is read in a different way now, and it becomes harder to be seen as an embodiment of this tradition, but rather as as an embodiment of, the third gender instead.
Right. That's fascinating. This is very fascinating.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Whereas when he was, it wasn't necessarily slanted. I mean, that was not necessarily the intentionality behind that.
not to say that, some of the specific qualities, who are we to say, what kind of relationship he had with, his follower that came to live with him, I mean, I think at that point, the question of like sexual orientation, for example, it's not like it wasn't there. I mean, because there's a lot of talk of how he didn't want to marry and ran away from his wife and all these kinds of things. But again, these are all taken up into other layers of significance. So it's just a matter of not imposing that whole modern framework of, MSM and, all these other categories or cross, transgender and things. This is all creating a map of human relations that is different from the map that I'm trying to present.
Right. No, well, this is fascinating, and this is why I really, really appreciate anthropological work. Not least of all your own work, which is genuinely so exciting and complex and rich. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background in psychoanalysis as well, and how that sort of how that helps you to make sense of, because despite our best efforts at not wanting to impose, at the same time, as already subjectivated beings ourselves, which isn't necessarily a fixed product, but we're always thinking through different theories and lenses. So I know that psychoanalysis, you make use of very interesting use of psychoanalytic theory to make sense of some of these ideas and Sufism in general.
Well, that's interesting that you asked that, because that's the sort of a good deal, or another one of the theoretical legs of this particular article. Because I sort of draw links between. It's not like I psychoanalyze.
No, of course.
Don't psychoanalyze Hasan Azad himself, but look at the way Lacan uses or thinks about metaphor and metonymy, and sort of also drawing on Freud, to gain access to the unconscious. And in effect, for both these Islamic literary theorists and poets, and for Lacan and his followers, Lacanian philosophers, for example, the sort of metaphor and metonymy are sort of paths to the unknown, really, and to that which can't be simply expressed through language, straightforward language, or that's not a good way of putting it, but referential language, I guess. And so the whole idea of a subject, a speaking subject for Lacan, that is barred from recognizing itself, and that the goal of psychoanalysis is to be able to recognize one's own desire. I think sort of maps in interesting ways onto this kind of Sufi understandings of the path to God. So it very much is something that I explore very briefly in the article, but really is its underpinning in many respects.
The
And
unknown.
but the
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
well, I was going to say the challenge of I've found in using Lacanian theories. Of course, Lacan himself is rather opaque to. To
He's almost unknowable, right? Himself. Yeah.
what?
His writing's almost undecipherable, right?
Yeah, and and yet I think some of the basic ideas are not so inaccessible.
Mm.
But so you get that reaction of, oh, I don't understand Lacan, you know. So, and even trying to articulate the theory in detail pretty quickly leads to another conceptual world that is you know, can not only alienating but also makes it hard to think how to think with in something like, you know, sort of a specific ethnographic situation. So that was part of the challenge of the paper too, was to sort of draw out some of these insights without moving into the abstract in a way that would make it hard to feel applicable to a concrete situation. So yeah, that was the challenge. And I expect, yeah, so I submitted the paper the day before we left Paris.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And surprisingly, I heard back from a Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which liked the paper. I heard back within, I don't know, a month or so, maybe 6 weeks. Maybe because everybody's just sitting around at home and has nothing else to do.
Well, that's great.
Usually these things take forever. And they just wanted some minor revisions. So I submitted those a couple of weeks ago. But they had basically accepted it with, you know, and said, please do some minor revisions.
Beautiful.
So I expect it to be coming out from JAR pretty, you know, without too much delay.
Beautiful. If you could say a little bit, because at this point you have a considerable amount of experience looking at interviewing and studying and participating in Sufism, both in Pakistan, of course, but also in Senegal, Morocco, and Mauritania, right? Can you say a little bit about some of the commonalities, but more important than commonalities, not more important, what I'm also very interested in are the sort of significant differences that you found between Sufic expressions in different contexts.
Yeah, in fact, I'm co-editing a volume right now with Wendell Marsh, who is an assistant professor at Rutgers in Newark, and who got his degree from Misas at Columbia, and Abdurrahman Sek, who's a professor at Gaston Berger University in Senegal. And that's actually one of the things I have to add to my introductory essay is, I haven't quite finished yet, is the relationship between my perceptions of going on in this Northwest Africa region and South Asia. Now, one of the reasons, before I answer that, one of the reasons that it's these particular three countries is that they cross the kind of traditional divide that policymakers and academics and everybody makes between North Africa and West Africa, which is also a racial divide traditionally. And so we wanted to sort of avoid that particular division and to explore how things, sort of look more at flows.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yes.
Yeah. So it's sort of in terms of local issues, then that flows and the racialization of these flows is a kind of always there, underlying the whole scene at many levels. In a way that's clearly, there's divides in South Asia too. The Pakistan-India border is one, but it's a different configuration. And so one interesting question is how that affects, how Sufism has evolved. And my focus is not the long view, but rather kind of what's going on now. Wendell is an historian, so he's definitely West Africa focused. So he's thinking kind of about the situation of Senegal in this context. Abdu is also, but although Abdu is more of an anthropologist, so we have two anthropologists and one historian. And so to answer your question, so that's one of the things. It's just that kind of racialized configuration. There are, for me, it's interesting to sort of jump to another region and see partly a kind of a transnational conversation going on right now that is partly influenced by the current global conversation about good Muslims and bad Muslims. That Sufis are good Muslims. That
Sufis are the good Muslims.
They're going to protect.
A friend of mine many years ago. This was many years ago during my undergrad. She just in passing had mentioned, the Sufis. She's Muslim herself, but anyway, she said, Sufis are the hippies of Islam, which is a very interesting description.
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but it's interesting.
Yeah. So that's an important part of the another aspect of the context or of the process that's happening right now. So I have an edited volume that's actually coming out this summer on I don't know if I can remember the exact title, but edited with Rosemary Corbett on basically the politics of Sufism in South Asia. And one of the things that we see here is the effects of this kind of U.S. and global policy promoting government promotion of Sufism, for example. And there are very similar things going on in South Asia. I mean, in Northwest Africa. So Morocco, it's been quite explicit. They were pretty anti-Sufi for many years, and now the king has been involved in a policy of promoting a certain kind of Sufism. It's like, we want a Sufism that is not what many of the educated elite call as kind of folk superstition. But we also don't want a kind of Salafi Islam that can be dangerous. So there's, and Morocco has a vision of, No,
I was just going to say that the Sufi music festival is sort of part of that.
Right? Yeah. So and Pakistan has sponsored international Sufi conferences and festivals and things as well. So you can see this process going on. And then, of course, even the Indian government has promoted Sufism at some of its major shrines as a kind of place of sites of communal harmony, and a place where the ideals of secularism can be seen on the ground. which
Mm.
affects what's going on at shrines in India. And so in Northwest Africa, we've rather interesting, very different cases in say Senegal and Morocco, where you get this promotion of a kind of a state-sponsored Sufism. In some ways, in both places, but it's played out rather differently. So in Morocco, you have this kind of recuperating Sufism, a Sufism that has been forgotten. So we have some of our researchers. This is part of a big project where we had a lot of local researchers, not a few local researchers who not only were doing these kinds of free-flowing conversations like what you're trying to promote between us, but ended up reflecting on some of their own experiences or even the effects of doing this research on their own families. So have one scholar who's now a graduate student at Misas, who said that doing the research has led her grandmother to kind of recall her, the kind of Sufi practices from her past that had been really kind of suppressed in favor of a strictly Quran reading.
Right, this is fascinating, isn't it? Right, how... And so anything that becomes state-sponsored is, it's not always going to be bad, but it's always going to have issues because it's a top-down approach. It's not something that's necessarily organically coming up from the ground upwards. And it's interesting for me to also reflect that an additional sort of aspect to this whole global problem, quote unquote, of Islam versus Sufism, or the sort of interrelationship, how it's manifested, is the very active promotion, which we've known for a very long time, but it's now coming out in more official sources and studies and things like that, of American policies to back a Wahhabi type of Islam being spread throughout the world as well. So it's almost like the two are at cross purposes, right? And so that's fascinating to note as well. That the US backs everyone and everything, right? Apparently, which promotes its own interests, but the US in broad-based terms, but
So it's right. So what I'm really, or we're focusing in this volume, is the kind of local effects of these government and global policies and discourse more broadly. And what's fascinating about Senegal is that there's a similar promotion of Sufism, but there was never this earlier period of an effort to reject Sufism, to modernize the population by rejecting superstition based.
Yes.
And in fact, the first president of independent Senegal, who was himself Christian, but he was really into Iqbal. You might be interested.
No
in this.
way! Fascinating! Wow.
So
you write a significant bit about your first monograph, and
So, and there was also the idea that Iqbal's thinking could sort of promote a kind of orientation to not just to Islam, but to kind of modernity that would be useful in the establishment of Senegal as a nation state. And so, and then the other thing that is different about Senegal is that you have these two major Sufi orders, that the Muridiya and the Tijaniya, that were really powerful and continue to be, and with no rupture. So there's been changes, and they're really very much affected by the changing political climate. But there's also been a kind of a continuity, and young people. One of the things I'm really interested in is the way young people are influenced by these forces and are taking up positions and orientations towards Sufism, and this is happening in both Senegal and Morocco. Mauritania is a somewhat different case, but it's also very much the sort of flow, things flowing across Mauritania, where there are the king of Morocco very much wants to be the kind of the head of Islam,
right,
for Africa,
right.
But a lot of the Sufis, the Tijanis and the Muridis are sort of flowing from Senegal to Morocco,
right,
real presence. And one of the interesting things that we're seeing in our research is that, I have one researcher who found it really easy to tell. There are a lot of Senegalese Sufis students in Morocco, and it's really easy to meet with them and talk to them about Sufism. It's much harder to get Moroccan youth to talk about Sufism, because even though they're getting involved in it, there's still a sort of a fear and fear of whether it's okay or not. There's it was so kind of abjected for so long that I'm really interested in the way that memory is being shaped, and the kind of emotional process of recovery. So there's also a psychodynamic dimension to how I'm thinking about this process. And that's different from what's going on in any of the other places. This kind of recovering something, sort of partially recovering something that is very emotionally linked to all of the colonial judgments about Moroccans. And Mauritania, of course, has this history of these kind of Sufis in the desert,
right.
But less. It's sort of less that's really explicit state positions about Sufis. So it's a little bit harder to nail it down, and I feel like I need to do a lot more research actually to get a better feel for this relationship, and I'm just beginning basically on that.
Okay, well,
but Hamza Yusuf was,
right now. I was just going to actually mention, if known to many Muslims in the West is the fact that Hamza Yusuf got his significant training in Islam in Mauritania, in the deserts of Mauritania. And then he, of course, comes back to the States and founds Zaytuna College eventually. And he has these very problematic, many would say, connections to centers of power, of course. And through one of his sheikhs, not the original sheikh in Mauritania under whom he studied, Sheikh Umar Abd al-Hajj, who passed away a few years ago, the grand old age of, I think, 108 or something, who never left the desert, apart from way back when he was very young to make Hajj by foot and then come back. But one of his most senior students, Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, who I think is in the UAE, very, very prominent sheikh. They, Hamza Yusuf and Abdullah bin Baya and group of other scholars, they published this, I forget what it's called now, I forget the title, it escapes me, but it was coming out of Morocco, where they were explicitly saying, Muslims denounce and cannot uh, allow for the persecution of non-Muslim minorities and things like that, and how that's based in the prophetic example and so forth. And at the same time, the questionable element, perhaps more explicitly questionable, is how Hamza Yusuf's, another one of his close confidants slash teachers maybe, is Habib Ali al-Jifri, for instance, who after Sisi comes to power, says to him, you are, in so many words to paraphrase him, but you are the rightful ruler, and we support you, right? So again, how these scholars position themselves in relation to centers of power. Hamza Yusuf more recently in relationship to Trump, being part of this this panel, the human rights panel, right? And he came under a lot of flack for this. What qualifications do you have for this, right?
Yeah.
The famously, I forget what's his name, Professor Khalid Abdul Fadl, who's a law professor as well as being a very serious scholar of Islam in the US. He said, there's so many people that could be, who have a background in law, like in an actual, in US law and things like that, that would be better placed to be in this sort of thing. So it's very interesting how people are constantly, and maybe this is a human problem, right? How we position ourselves to perceived authority figures.
Right.
But to what extent we sell out, this is the question.
Yeah, or is it selling out?
Is it selling out? Right. It's right. This is.
Yeah. Right. So again, one can ask, what is thinking about Mauritania? What is the impact of this kind of international renown as a place where Sufis hang out in the desert, on the sort of Mauritanian society, state, self-perception? I actually did visit one village in the desert, an amazing drive, like 4 hours across sand dunes.
Wow.
For this, and I'm far from the first person who's been there. This, if you go on, now I'm forgetting the name of the village, but if you go online, you can see, sort of tourists who describe kind of trying to find these various villages and such. But and this one has been written about. But the head of this village is very much tied into, again, a global community, and it's sort of founded a utopian community that's sort of promoting certain kinds of education. It really is an experiment in a kind of a utopian vision of an Islamic community. In interesting contrast to some of the other, like there's another village that's, 20 minutes away across the desert that is also, there's a prominent madrasa that's also very Sufi oriented, but organized under very different principles. There's just this incredible contrast, and it's viewed as traditional, as opposed to this kind of utopian vision. So there are interesting things going on in Mauritania, and I also interviewed some people who, sort of were very careful about what they said about Sufism and the government. So I feel like there's stuff going on that, and I'm sure others have written about that I, haven't fully. A lot of the literature is in French, and takes me a little longer to master it than in other places. But I just feel like I've been doing so many different projects that I just need the time to sort of settle in and really kind of try to get a better sense of the Mauritanian situation.
Well, no, this is really what's so fun for me and for many others about your work, where it is so multidisciplinary and sort of very, it's very I love your curiosity. As someone who's very curious myself, it's you go with where what's interesting. And speaking to the question of the global community, um, to use that phrase, of course, we are, and people have written about this extensively at this point, but we have been in this sort of unique situation now, what many people have been calling the global village, by virtue of digitality. And of course, with COVID, the pluses and the minuses, the pros and the cons of living online are fully sort of before us right now. I mean, the very fact that we're connecting right now online speaks to that.
Mm.
But to what extent do you think, as far as you can tell, has the digital medium and digitality itself, the sort of modes of being and living through the digital space, how have they impacted the evolution? It's a problematic word, but the sort of the shifts in some of these discourses. Have you been able to pick up on that a little bit?
A little bit. I actually did an imminent frame piece on the SSRC
yes
website, on some of these new modes of communication, sort of focusing on the sort of it's kind of India focused on the major Chishti Sufi shrine, Ajmer, and a visit. Well, just how some of the sorry, I'm not going at it the right angle, but so things like the Sufi music festival in Morocco as an example of not only the event itself, but the digitization of the website, sort of appealing to broader audiences. And this is something that's happening in an interesting way in Ajmer, because there are a whole bunch of different what they call gadi machines or sujata machines, caretakers or successors, some of whom are very much in the kind of older mode of kind of controlling assets that come through the shrine and sponsoring events. And then there's one who is very much using digital media and sort of other forms of appeal, not just digital, but also sort of an art gallery and this piece that I wrote sort of focuses on a visit by, I'm trying to remember his name, this major Naqshbandi order that is important in the US and Europe.
Oh, the Haqqaniya, yeah.
Right. So the sort of the American Khalifa, who's actually originally Turkish, I think, but who pays a visit to Ajmer, and he is met by this younger Gadi Nashin, who and the whole thing has been filmed, is on YouTube, you can see it, and then they finally get up to this manzil, this place where they're about to sit and have a conversation. And the first thing that happens is that, so there's somebody beside, this sheikh who, and he's about to speak, and there's this iPhone sort of being held by one of the people in the audience, this small group of people. And instead of speaking, to the other sheikh or to the group
into the phone.
Into the phone.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Greece followers all over the world.
Fascinating, yeah.
So,
that awareness is very, very interesting,
yeah. and
Marshall
you know,
so just to that point, it just reminded me. Marshall McLuhan wrote very sort of insightfully on the role that the camera plays, right, in terms of how we, of course, perceive ourselves, but also as a result of how we perceive ourselves, how we project ourselves then to the camera. And he was writing, for instance, a while ago now, but with regards to televised sporting events. I'd never thought about it like this, that he was saying even how the players were moving was affected by the fact that the camera was there, which is fascinating to think that they wanted to be more observable, even in the context of a sport which one would think is, it's all about the game. You're focused on the ball or whatever it is. So that's very, very interesting. So that changes our very, our subjectivity, right? We're changing ourselves somehow, right? A little bit at least.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was just one of those. I mean, for me, I discovered this thing on the internet, and watching it, it was just a moment of being totally startled, and not even knowing who these people were at first. It was like, why a phone, and then I did the background work and figured out who these people were and what was going on. And then so somebody for somebody like me who's had experience watching these kinds of interactions, but not knowing the particulars. I knew it was the Chishti shrine. I gathered that this was probably a Gadi machine, but not knowing even who was visiting at that moment, it was just utterly startling to have that turn to the iPhone.
Right.
And a vivid demonstration of, as you say, how our bodily practices are shaped by these media. So I have thought about it to some extent, not necessarily systematically, but it's an important part of just all these. I mean, my own work, I look at the way these different factors of a particular historical moment come together to shape that moment. It's a kind of maybe a particular theory of history as well that I live with.
Right. Well, and I mean, I can't help but feel that as we, as far as I can tell, are entering into this new phase in the human experiment, right? This sort of the new normal, as it keeps being drilled into us, right? That digitality is. Pardon?
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, because of COVID and the sort of after effects, that digitality is really going to become even more entrenched in our lives, or we're going to become more entrenched into it. And right, so that's
and I think what we can see among Sufis is a real effort to use the medium to change the nature of one's leadership and the following that one has as a Sufi. And the Haqqaniya are particularly emphatic about this in their way of building relationships between sheikhs and followers, and in many respects kind of transforming that relationship. So it's at one level more immediate, so that the follower has a good view of the sheikh. For example.
Right.
You're not at the back of a vast crowd, and yet, the sheikh doesn't see you.
Right. And the Haqqaniya, I know. I mean, a little. I mean, not that much about, but I actually, as a side note, was initiated in one of the London branches into the Haqqaniya, and they're very interesting. They've been doing this for a while, where you can what's it called? I did it in person, but you can also be initiated online. which usually
Yeah.
Sufis don't like that idea. They typically, and maybe these things are changing now, but typically they say, no, you have to be in the presence of the sheikh, and there's a sort of more
Hmm.
formal aspect to it. But maybe they were just ahead of their time. This is going back some years ago that they're already doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think I mean, and you think about, I said, well, then the sheikh doesn't see you, but actually now the sheikh can see you. I mean,
Right,
Zoom,
right,
for example.
right. No, that's true. That's also true.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm sure that the development of Zoom will have an impact on the nature of Sufi gatherings, for example, because Sufis are having Zoom meetings just as much as everybody else is. I imagine.
Right.
So,
This
yeah.
is Zoom life, right?
And you could even have closed inner circles.
Right.
If you
Yeah,
have
I've been in
closed.
different, not Sufi, but different sort of religious spiritual sort of gatherings online, which is just fascinating. But I wanted to ask you maybe one or two more things on the question of how, as an anthropologist, as someone who is interviewing, quote unquote, but having conversations with people about their sort of backgrounds and things like that. And I've heard you mention about the lines being blurred between, to what extent are you a researcher? To what extent are you, participating? And to what extent is there sort of mutual influence? And I was hoping you could comment a little bit more about that. And also, from my understanding of things, that you also mentioned the idea of bringing more humanism into it, right? And this is what I'm trying to do, for instance, with these podcasts, where I want it to be a more human exchange rather than being very sort of formal. That it by its very nature, is it part of being human to be influenced by one another? That every encounter, if it's of substance, must leave some sort of an impact and a trace, as it were, on each person.
Yeah. I would say I like that image of the trace. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think that one of the big problems with the Northwest Africa project as it was getting going was the image of the interview that researchers had. We spent a long time, so it was a kind of a team project, and we spent quite a long time trying to communicate with the researchers our model of interviewing as conversation, really. But even so, that idea of the interview as a tool for gathering information, where you have the interviewer who is at some level an expert, and then the interviewee who is talking about an expert in science, the interviewer.
Sure. Yes.
And then the interviewee as knowing the local scene and communicating
Yes.
information about that scene.
Right.
And, we tried to move it more into Walter Benjamin's idea of storytelling, where there aren't answers exactly. There is richness of experience that will change the interviewer. And I think that the change happens in both directions. But what we're really seeing the project kind of evolved into something where the focus has been as much on the experiences for the researchers and how it affects their lives, as it has been on the interviewees, who are, of course, also affected by the experience of going through these conversations and sort of learning, being able to tell their stories, really. I think has been an important aspect of it. Because I think especially I keep thinking of the Moroccan environment where people were basically have been shaped as modern Moroccan subjects who had to kind of suppress, a lot of the Moroccan past, and including their own lives, and not be judged. Sort of their concern is being judged as being ignorant, or if they show any of the sides of their experience. So it's a matter of everybody being transformed, because the more we do this, we and many others do this kind of research. It's a way of it's like psychoanalysis, not in the sense of psychoanalyzing people, but in the sense of recovery and recall of a collectively suppressed past, and the kind of transformation of the speaking subject as part of that process.
That's beautiful. Now, I'm just reminded right now of this verse in the Quran. I may be conflating two verses, but the idea that God, from a Muslim point of view, says that if he so wanted, he could have made all of humanity, as one people, one community. But he didn't, and he created people of different tongues and tribes and tongues so that they could come to know one another. And I think in that very exchange, there's a deep enriching that happens. And to your point about mentioning Benjamin's idea of storytelling versus which he felt, which I understood from me. I wasn't aware of this, just listening to one of the other talks elsewhere, that he was making note of the fact that this moment was coming to a close, and that we were entering into this period of information, which is just kind of raw data, which is completely unconnected. There's no whole, as it were. In another one of your articles, The Illusion of Wholeness, you sort of argue very convincingly and very interestingly that the sort of all these disparate aspects of being human in say one's life up until this point, we find a way of creating a type of narrative that brings them into a whole of sorts, as coherent as possible, right? Just for the very sake of our daily functioning. But now we've entered into this moment where it's all data, right? We're living in the age of big data, which they don't even know what to do with it all. But I'm not sure where I was going with all that. But storytelling versus just raw data. I think you even mentioned some of your researchers initially, they had created like a questionnaire, which they got the interviewees to answer. They were done in 20 minutes, and you said, well, no, you should spend a little longer. Actually, it should be more free flowing and enriching and rich.
Yeah, and right, encourage people to communicate their kind of unique positioning in the world, and the ways that they've navigated these very disparate forces that shape their lives. That's, again, my vision of history of these sort of multiple forces that are converging, but aren't necessarily at all the same, or even necessarily, well, I suppose these forces themselves are influenced by each other, but you get unique configurations, and each historical subject is uniquely positioned to and constructs a worldview. Again, that's not coherent. I think that that side of my work didn't come out in our conversation until now. That the idea that we don't construct a single coherent either worldview or a subject position or a self, that that we are very contextual. And so our experience of ourself is very different in different settings, which is why I think I wrote The Illusion of Wholeness, which focuses on this phenomenon of shifting selves. I wrote that shortly after becoming a mother. I think Julia, my oldest, was 3 in the summer that I wrote that. And so it was a kind of a personal experience of being a woman and a mother and, trying to sort of maintain a household and be an academic and having the pressures of publishing and, tenure and all that stuff. I just realized the extent to which I would be a different person as I was sitting, I guess I was using computers then, sitting at my computer, and, trying to pull together my experience and field work and all that, and then shifting to be a mother, and to be a wife and all these things. And I personally, during this time of COVID and having a house, all my children, I have 3 daughters, all 3 of them back here, with attendant families, and, kind of being the mother in the household again. And then, my work, which actually kind of disappeared completely for at least a week, and they actually ended up staying for, we still have, as I said, one of them still here with her partner, but the others were here for 5 weeks. Usually they come for 1 week, So, it really vividly experiencing that shifting selves, and it's not just, playing different roles. In anthropology, there used to be, and sociology, this sort of emphasis on role theory, but it's more than playing different roles. It's actually experiencing oneself as a different person.
Right. And that definitely rings true for me. It's really inhabiting those spaces. Well, this has been really incredible. Thank you so much, Kathy. It's always such a joy. I mean, I learned so much from you over the years. I'm really, really very grateful, and I still learn from you. And I'm really grateful to you always.
Well, it's really been fascinating watching how you're developing as well, and the direction that your work is going in.
Well, I'm very I'm not traditional by any means, as you know. So I like to do my own thing, which may be totally incomprehensible to most people, even myself sometimes. But it's we have to do. What was it? Joseph Campbell said, who's not really respected in academic circles anymore, but I think he's interesting. He said, "Follow your bliss," right? So,
I think the issue of who's respected and who's not has to be taken with a grain of salt as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's my approach. Generally, I mean, if it resonates with you, it resonates with you, right? It's for the longest time in psychoanalysis, it was Freud was having his moment. It seems to be the case that Jung is increasingly having his moment.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know. This is from very serious sort of psychologists. They're referring a lot more to Jung these days. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I've sort of thought a little bit about Jung in connection with some of the things that I've been thinking about, but but there's always the stigma, that's, but thinking about the gender stuff, Jung is certainly relevant to bring into the conversation.
Well, it'd be interesting if one could make use of both and all, right? Then it's like, stigmatize me, but I'm using everyone who seems interesting and relevant to the conversations. Why not?
Right. Yeah. Anyway, well, it's really
good. Yes.
Great to have a chance to see you again after so long.
I know. Likewise, really wonderful. Thanks.
I'm glad to hear you recovered from COVID.
I know, God, it was honestly at points I honestly thought I wasn't going to make it through. It had gotten so bad. There were nights where
Oh,
I was
really?
really struggling to breathe. It was really bad. So I even at one point I made a prayer to God. I said, God, if it's my time, like I'm ready. I was mentally making that preparation, but then I said, and however, if you think I should stick around to do your work a little bit, then let me stick around a little more. So it had gotten to that stage, honestly. But I'll have to say, my dog.
Then your father was right. You should have gone to the hospital.
No, I'm so glad. I think I'm convinced if I went to hospital, I wouldn't have made it. In all honesty,
Oh, really?
yeah, honestly, because yeah, they do. But I was always kind of observing my dog, and thankfully she wasn't stressed out at any point. So that gave me some peace. I was like, if things are really bad, I feel like she would
Yeah.
be responding in such a way. She would seem really calm through pretty much the whole thing. So that was some reassurance for me.
Well, that's
However,
good.
rightly or wrongly. Anyway,
Yeah.
thanks again,
Well, I'm
Catherine.
glad you made it.
I know.
Okay.
Take care now. All the best.
Okay.
God bless you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.